The sunrise was a pale, bloody smear over Mescal Flats, an open wound in the sky that promised no rain, only more heat. The wind, which never seemed to sleep out here, was already at its work, scouring the town with fine grit. It hissed through the splintered boards of the perimeter fences and rattled the loose tin roof of the livery. It was a mean wind, carrying the taste of dust and a deep, abiding thirst. This was a land that knew how to wait for things to die. Rowena Vale felt the grit slide under the collar of her canvas work shirt. She set her jaw and kept moving. Her rhythm was its own kind of sound in the early morning quiet, the heavy thump of her right boot, followed by the deliberate, sliding drag of her left. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. The sound was as much a part of her as the coal smoke that lived in her hair or the scent of hot iron that clung to her skin. Her left leg, the one caught under the weight of a snapped wagon axle a year prior, was a map of dull fire this morning. She'd learned to bank that fire, to wall it off behind a dam of sheer will, but it was always there, simmering. She hid the evidence of it, the twisted, scarred flesh, and the brace she'd forged herself beneath a high-topped, sturdy leather boot, its sole worn smooth from the drag. She was the town blacksmith, the only one for 50 miles, and she also mended the coaches that rattled through the San Piedra territory. She was 24 years old, and she did not have time for pain. She was pushing a wheelbarrow with a cracked iron hub, a new replacement wheel strapped to its bed. The weight was heavy, meant for a man's shoulders. But Rowena's shoulders were broad and strong from the hammer and the bellows. It was only the leg that betrayed her, forcing her to lock her knee with every push, turning the simple act of crossing the street into a measured, halting battle. From behind the warped shutters of the Copper Willow Saloon, the early drinkers were already watching. Their voices were low, rough as burlap. "There goes the gimp," muttered one, the sound of whiskey thick in his throat. "Pushing that barrow like she's pushing her own damn penance. Heard tell she was looking at the bolt of lace in Miller's Mercantile yesterday." Another voice chimed in, followed by a wet, hacking cough. A third man laughed, a dry, rattling sound, like snake bones shaken in a jar. "Lace, what's she gonna do with Lace? You seen her walk. She'll trip her way down the aisle, a crippled hen trying to dream of a wedding dress. Ain't no man looking for that kind of baggage, not unless the baggage comes with a deed." Their laughter followed her, snagging on the wind. But Rowena didn't turn her head. She'd learned to wear their mockery like she wore the dust and inevitable, irritating layer that she would wash off at the end of the day. Their words couldn't set a wagon wheel or shoe a horse. They were useless. On the porch of the Mercantile, leaning against a post that held up the broad wooden awning, stood Eamon Pike. He was a quiet man who owned the horse ranch out at the edge of Juniper Basin, a place of high, lonely mesas and deep arroyos. He was not a big man, but he was built like the land, nothing soft on him, all lean muscle and sun-scorched patience. He held a cup of coffee, the steam whipping away instantly in the wind, and his eyes, the color of weathered slate, watched Rowena. His gaze was different. It wasn't the pitying look of the preacher's wife or the cruel amusement of the saloon men. It was just a look. It was steady and quiet, and it missed nothing. He saw the way her shoulders tensed when she hit a rut, the slight, sharp intake of breath she thought no one heard. He saw the set of her jaw. He saw her push that barrow, loaded with 100 pounds of iron, up the slight incline to her smithy, and he did not move to help her. He knew she would hate that. Instead, he just watched, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the shifting dust of the street. The air in Mescal Flats was thick with more than just dust these days. A new rumor had blown in. More persistent than the wind, the Silver Comet Railroad was looking to push a spur line through the territory. Suddenly, the barren, sun-baked patch of land that Dry Creek Crossing sat on, the very land that Rowena's smithy occupied, was of interest. The whispers started a month ago. Strangers in city suits, surveyors with their strange, three-legged instruments, had been seen out by Painter's Bluff, and then the pressure began. It was subtle at first, a friendly offer from a man at the land office, a casual question at the saloon about what price it would take to sell. Now, it was less subtle. Fences were being cut. A well was fouled with lime. The few small ranchers and homesteaders were getting nervous. And then Hollis Crane had arrived. He stepped out of the copper willow just as Rowena reached the front of her forge, the massive double doors that opened onto the street. Crane was a man who seemed to have no dust on him. His black frock coat was immaculate, his boots polished to a high shine, his thin lips pressed together in what he probably thought was a smile. He represented the railroad's right-of-way committee, and he carried a leather satchel full of papers he called voluntary purchase agreements. He blocked Rowena's path, forcing her to stop. The wheelbarrow's iron wheel grated in the dirt. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice smooth and oiled, a stark contrast to the gritty air. A difficult morning for such heavy labor. Rowena wiped a streak of sweat and soot from her forehead with her arm, leaving a muddy patch. "It's just work, Mr. Crane, same as any other morning. Now, if you'll excuse me." She tried to move the barrow around him. He shifted, a small, polite sidestep that blocked her again. From the corner of her eye, she saw Eamon Pike set his coffee cup down on the porch railing, his body straightening. He did not move, but his stillness had changed. "I am here," Crane continued, that polite smile never wavering, "to extend the committee's final offer for this establishment, a generous offer, considering the fluctuating value of property in an undeveloped territory, $500. Rowena almost laughed. The number was an insult. The anvil alone was worth half that. "Mr. Crane, I told you last week, and the week before that, the smithy is not for sale. Miss Vale, progress is a powerful engine," he said, tapping his leather satchel. "The silver comet will bring prosperity to this valley. It will bring trade and civilization. You are one small shop, standing in the way of that. It would be a shame, a terrible shame, if your operations were found to be non-compliant with territorial safety codes. A forge is a dangerous thing. Fires do happen." The threat was as clear as the bright, harsh sunlight. Rowena drew herself up. She might be limping, she might be covered in grime, but in her own forge, she was a queen. "Are you threatening to burn me out, Mr. Crane?" Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried. The men in the saloon went quiet. Across the street, Eamon Pike took one step off the porch, then stopped, his hands loosely at his sides. Hollis Crane's smile tightened. "I am threatening nothing, my dear. I am merely stating a fact of commerce. Think on the offer. $500 is a great deal of money for someone in your position." He let his eyes drift pointedly down to her left leg. Rowena felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, angry tide. She gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow until her knuckles went white. Before she could say a word, a shadow fell between them. Eamon Pike had crossed the street. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion, making no sound. He stood beside Rowena, not looking at Crane, but at her. He held out a small, heavy canvas bag. It clinked. "Brought these from the basin," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. "Forged them myself last night. You were running low on the good 3-inch nails." He placed the bag in the bed of the wheelbarrow, next to the new wheel. It was a simple act, a delivery. But it was also an answer. It was a statement. It said, "We are still building. We are not selling. We are not leaving." Hollis Crane looked at Eamon, then at Rowena, and his thin smile finally vanished. He saw the bag of new nails. He saw the silent, immovable man standing next to the defiant, soot-stained woman. He saw two separate, stubborn things that had, in that moment, become a single, unmovable wall. "You are making a mistake, Miss Vale," Crane hissed, his politeness evaporating. "Both of you." He turned on his polished heel and stalked back toward the land office, his black coat flapping like the wings of a crow. Rowena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking. Eamon looked at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were on her, steady. "He'll be back," he said. It wasn't a question. I know, Rowena said, her voice tight. The wind picked up again, this time carrying a new scent. It was the smell of distant rain, a promise that would likely be broken, and something else, the faint, bitter smell of old ash. It was a smell that reminded her of the accident, of burned wood and charred hopes. It was a reminder that what had burned once could easily burn again. Eamon nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. He glanced at the wheelbarrow. That hub looks heavy. I can manage it, Rowena said, her pride flaring up. Sharp and automatic. I know you can, Eamon said, and he turned and walked back to the mercantile, picked up his coffee cup, and leaned against the post, as if the entire confrontation had never happened. Rowena watched him go, a strange, tight feeling in her chest. She grabbed the handles of the wheelbarrow and gave a powerful push. The wheel turned. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. She reached the massive doors of her smithy and shoved them open, the heavy wood groaning on its hinges. The familiar, comforting smell of coal, steel, and horse sweat washed over her. This was her place. This was her ground. She looked back at the empty street, at the dust devils dancing where Crane had stood. She looked at the bag of nails Eamon had given her. Then she looked down at her own stubborn, ruined leg, half hidden in the shadows of the forge. She whispered the words to the cooling anvil, a vow spoken to the iron and the fire. If they want me on my knees, she said, her voice a low, fierce thing, I will stand tall on this bad leg just to spite them. It had been a little over a year, but the memory was as sharp as a shard of fresh broken glass, a thing she could not handle without bleeding. It happened on the high grade descending from Painter's Bluff, a notoriously treacherous stretch of road that wagoners usually took at a crawl, their wheels chained. A freight wagon, overloaded with grain sacks from the high country farms, had lost its brake. The heavy pin had snapped, and the wagon, weighing a good 3,000 pounds, had become a runaway cannon. Rowena had been on the side of the road, checking the shoe on a skittish mare. When she heard it, it was not a sound of wheels, but a sound of screaming, the high, terrified shriek of wood and iron being torn apart, and underneath it, the thinner, sharper screams of children, the Miller twins, no older than 7, and the baker's boy, who was 9, had been playing in the dry wash at the bottom of the bluff. They had been building a fort of tumbleweeds, directly in the wagon's path. Rowena hadn't thought. She had only moved. She ran, her own legs strong and sure, and shoved the baker's boy so hard he tumbled end over end into the scrub. She grabbed the twins, one under each arm, and threw them bodily toward the embankment. She had saved them, all 3 of them, but she had taken 1 second too long to save herself. The wagon did not hit her directly. It struck a large granite boulder at the edge of the wash, and the entire chassis buckled. The front axle, a solid piece of forged iron as thick as a man's arm, snapped like a dry twig. The wagon, the boulder, and the collapsing earth all met in a single, catastrophic moment. The heavy front wheel, still attached to the broken half-axle, had come off its moorings and pinned her left leg against the rock face. She remembered the sound, a wet, compact crunch. She remembered looking down and seeing her leg bent at an angle that legs were not meant to bend, the cracked white of her own bone gleaming through the torn denim. And then, the pain had come a white-hot, blinding universe of it that had burned away the world. They'd brought her to the makeshift infirmary, which was just a back room in the preacher's house. It smelled of iodine, lye soap, and the ever-present, dusty smell of lime. The doctor, a man who mostly worked on cowboys with bullet holes or bad whiskey, had taken one look at the pulped mess of her leg and shaken his head. He'd wanted to take it. Below the knee, Miss Vale, it's the only way to spare you the fever. Rowena, floating on a gray sea of laudanum, had found the strength to grab his collar. You touch a saw to me, she'd whispered, her voice a dry rasp. And I will live long enough to find you, and I will kill you with my bare hands. He had backed off, grumbling. He'd set the bones as best he could, stitched the flesh, and told everyone she would be dead in a week from gangrene. Rowena had refused to die. She had also refused to be an invalid. The first 3 weeks were a blur of fever and agony. But in the 4th week, when the fever broke and the pain settled into a deep, grinding ache, her mind had cleared. She was in a cot, in a room that was not hers, and her forge was cold. That was unacceptable. She had spent her life understanding how materials worked, how to bend iron, how to temper steel, how to join wood. She would do the same for her own body. She had sent word to the tanner and paid him for a long, thick strap of cured leather. While the preacher's wife was out, Rowena had tied one end to the high iron bedstead. She'd wrapped the other end around her waist, and, bracing herself against the wall, she had pulled herself up. The pain was so absolute, so all-consuming, that she had blacked out. She woke up on the floor, soaked in sweat. She had done it again, and again, for a solid week. She taught herself to stand, using the strap as a brace, her muscles shaking, tears of pure physical agony streaming down her face. When she could stand for 1 minute, she aimed for 2. When she could stand for 2, she untied the strap and tried to balance. She taught herself to walk again in that small, lime-scented room, her only crutch a leather strap and a will harder than any piece of steel she had ever hammered. She refused rest. Rest was for the dying. Eamon Pike had been one of her last customers before the accident. She was in the middle of rebracing the main support beams for his largest horse stable, a big job that required complex joinery. The accident had left the job half-finished. He had shown up at the infirmary on the 10th day. He was a man who seemed to take up no more space than was necessary, and his silence was a heavy, comfortable thing, like a wool blanket. He had stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. For a full minute, Rowena, half mad with pain, had glared at him. "If you've come to stare at the gimp, Pike, get in line." He had just looked at her, his slate-gray eyes taking in the sweat on her face, the rumpled sheets, the anger. He hadn't said a word about the leg. He hadn't offered pity. He just stepped inside, walked to the small bedside table, and placed a battered tin thermos on it. "Honeysuckle tea," he'd said, his voice that low, gravelly rumble. "My mother used to say it was good for the blood." And then he had left. He came back the next evening, and the evening after that. For 2 solid weeks, he appeared at precisely 6 o'clock, just as the sun was beginning to bleed into the mesas. He never stayed for more than 5 minutes. He would enter, nod to her, take the empty thermos from the day before, and replace it with a full, hot one. He never asked how she was feeling. He never mentioned the stable. He just brought the tea. The first time they had what anyone might call a conversation was the day she had first stood on her own, without the strap, for almost 30 seconds. She was breathing hard, her body trembling. When he'd knocked, he'd entered, seen her braced against the wall, her knuckles white, and he'd stopped, hesitating, as if he'd walked in on something private. He'd fumbled for words. The tea is hot." He'd placed it on the table, his movements awkward for the first time. I'll come back." A bubble of something that felt like laughter, or maybe just relief, had risen in Rowena's chest. It had surprised her. She smiled. A real, if weary, smile. "Eamon," she'd said, and he'd stopped in the doorway, turned back to her. "Our silence," she'd said, sinking back onto the cot, the leg screaming, "is its own kind of talk, and I thank you for it, and for the tea." He had looked at her for a long time, then he'd nodded, a short, sharp dip of his head, and left. When she'd finally returned to the smithy, her leg a stiff, uncooperative stranger she had to drag behind her, their strange ritual had changed. He would stop by, not with tea, but with some small, practical problem. A bridle buckle that needed a new pin, a harness strap that was fraying. Excuses, she knew, to check on her. One evening, he'd found her struggling to read a pamphlet from the Studebaker Company about new axle assemblies. the print fine and the light from her oil lamp low. He'd cleared his throat. "I can read it to you, if you like. Your eyes look tired." So they had sat, him on an upturned crate, her on her workbench stool, her bad leg propped up. He'd read the dry, technical prose, his voice stumbling over the bigger words. "It's torsional. Amen, not torsional," she'd corrected gently. He'd grunted, but he'd said it right the next time. In return, he'd picked up a pamphlet she had on equine anatomy. "You look at the diagrams," he'd said, tapping the paper, "but you're not seeing it right. A horse's strength ain't in the picture. You judge a horse by the space between its last rib and its hip, a hand's breadth, no more. That's where the power comes from." They'd built a new language, a language of technical manuals, of forge work, and the silent assessment of animals. It was a language of mutual respect, built on competence. He was the only person in Mescal Flats who did not treat her as if she were broken. He treated her as if she were a tool that had been damaged and was now being reforged stronger, maybe in the places that mattered. The first time she'd walked to the saloon, 6 months after the accident, had been a test. She'd needed to talk to a freighter about a shipment of coal. She'd felt every eye on her as she'd made that long walk from the door to the bar. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. The saloon had gone quiet. Then the laughter had started, low and cruel. "Look at that. Boys, the gimp's got a new dance." She'd frozen, her face hot, the old familiar rage coiling in her gut. And then Eamon Pike, who'd been in the corner nursing a small beer, had simply stood up and walked to her side. He didn't say a word. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't threaten the men who were laughing. He just stood next to her, a solid, immovable object, and ordered a beer. The laughter had faltered, then died. One snicker at a time, it had just fallen to the ground, useless, like a badly thrown horseshoe. He'd finished his beer, paid for hers, and walked with her to the door, his steps unconsciously slowing to match her own halting rhythm. Their bond had been forged in silence, in shared work, and in the space of a rainy night. A massive thunderstorm had blown in from the north, a real gully washer, Rowena's smithy roof, which she hadn't had the time or the mobility to properly patch, had sprung a dozen new leaks. One of them was directly over her main bellows, threatening to ruin the leather. She was struggling, trying to haul a heavy canvas tarp across the rafters while balanced on a ladder, her bad legs shaking. The door had burst open, and Eamon was there, rain streaming from his hat. He didn't ask. He just took the tarp from her hands. "You hold the ladder," he'd said, "and keep the light on me." He'd climbed up into the dark, wet rafters, a man as sure-footed as one of his own mountain ponies. Rowena had stood at the base of the ladder, her hands gripping the wood, her legs screaming from the strain. Rain dripped from the roof, cold and sharp. A stream of it found a path down the back of Eamon's neck, and he'd flinched. Another stream found its way down her own, but as it slid beneath her collar, mixing with her sweat, it had felt strangely warm. A shared discomfort, a shared fight. He'd secured the tarp, and the leak over the bellows had stopped. When the wind had finally died and the rain had softened to a drum, they'd sat, soaked and exhausted, facing each other by the forge. The fire was banked, but the bellows gave a soft sigh as the air settled. She'd had a piece of steel, a long bar intended for a new axle, resting near the heat. The low, orange glow of the embers reflected on its surface. It was untampered steel, a thing that looked hard, but was still, in its heart, soft. It had not yet been put through the fire and the water to find its true strength. Rowena had looked at the steel, and then she had looked at Eamon, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his face streaked with soot. He had looked back at her, and in the quiet of the forge, with the smell of rain and hot metal in the air, something new and untempered, something both hard and soft, was taking shape between them. Hollis Crane did not strike with the clean, immediate force of a hammer. He worked like damp, slow-moving rust, a corrosion that weakened the foundations before the structure ever knew it was compromised. He had been seen, 2 evenings after the confrontation on the street, slipping into the back room of the Copper Willow Saloon. This was a room kept for high-stakes card games and low-morals negotiations, a place that smelled of stale cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. His companion in that dim yellow light was Sheriff Murdoch. Murdoch was a man defined by his appetites, his ambitions having long since outgrown his meager county salary. A considerable gut strained the buttons of his vest, hanging precariously over a gun belt that saw more use as a counterweight than as a tool of justice. His eyes, small and quick, were not the eyes of a lawman. They were the eyes of an appraiser, constantly calculating the profit and loss in every civic interaction. Crane, as always, was immaculate. He sat with his back to the wall, a glass of untouched water in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was a smooth, oiled murmur, almost lost in the raucous noise of the saloon beyond the door. The Silver Comet Railroad. Sheriff is an entity that values public safety above all else. We are bringing progress, and progress must be orderly. Murdoch grunted, his gaze fixed on the small, heavy leather pouch Crane had placed on the table between them. Safety, right. A town like this, Crane continued, steepling his thin fingers, has many unregulated structures, fire hazards, particularly a blacksmith's forge. All that coal, the open flame, the potential for catastrophe. Rowena Vale runs a clean shop, Murdoch said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was testing the waters. Does she? Crane's thin smile did not reach his eyes. Our surveyors noted several concerns. It would be a terrible tragedy if that forge, situated precisely where our main depot is planned, were to cause a fire that endangered the town. It would be a profound act of civic duty for the sheriff's office to inspect any properties that might pose such a threat. Crane slid the leather pouch across the rough-sawn table. It was heavy, and it made a soft, compelling clink. The railroad is, of course, willing to make a generous donation to the sheriff's discretionary fund for the trouble. Murdoch's hand, thick and pale, covered the pouch and drew it into his lap. He did not count it. He did not need to. He could feel the weight of at least $200 in double eagles. A forge is a dangerous thing. All right, Murdoch said, his voice suddenly full of civic concern. I'll look into it. First thing in the morning. The next dawn. Rowena arrived at the smithy just as the first gray light was pushing the stars from the sky. She smelled the cold, dead ash of her fire pit. But there was another, sharper smell, fresh-cut pine and cheap paint. A bright red sign was nailed squarely to the double doors of her forge. She limped closer, her heart seizing, the familiar thump-drag of her walk quickening in the dirt. Thump-drag. Thump-drag. Condemned. The word was painted in stark, black letters, below it, in smaller, neater script, structure unsafe, by order of the San Piedra Territorial Authority, Office of Sheriff B. Murdoch. A thick, new-looking chain was wrapped around the handles of both doors, drawn tight and secured with a heavy, brass padlock. Affixed to the chain, gleaming dully in the morning light, was a blob of red wax, pressed with what looked like the official county seal. She was locked out. This is illegal, she whispered to the empty street. But the sign, the chain, and the wax seal looked very, very legal. She was still standing there, her mind racing, her hands clenched into fists, when she heard the sound of a horse being ridden hard. Eamon Pike pulled his fast gelding, Kestrel, to a stop a few feet away, kicking up a cloud of dust. He must have ridden from Juniper Basin before sunrise. He dismounted in one fluid motion. He didn't waste time on greetings or expressions of shock. He just walked past her and stood in front of the doors. He looked at the sign. He looked at the chain. He put one finger out and touched the wax seal. Murdoch, he said. It was a statement of fact. Crane, Rowena answered, her voice tight with a cold, rising fury. Crane bought him. Eamon tested the chain. It was solid. He knelt and examined the padlock. Cheap brass, But it'll hold. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the street, which was still empty. He turned to her, his face grim. You can't stay here, Rowena. They've shut you down. They'll send thugs next, to make sure you stay shut. This is my forge, she said, the words torn from her. I know what it is, he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Come back with me, Pike Hollow. I've got a small bunkhouse. Used to be the foreman's. It's empty. It's clean. You can stay there. No one will find you. You'll be safe. He was offering her a way out, a safe harbor from the storm that had just broken over her, a part of her, the part that was exhausted, the part where the old ache in her leg was flaring up. Wanted to say yes. She wanted to ride to his high, lonely ranch and let him be the wall, but she shook her head. I appreciate it, Eamon, more than you know. She turned and put her hand on the rough, splintered wood of her own door. But if I run, they win. If I let them chase me off my own land, I'm just what they say I am. A cripple, someone to be pushed aside. She looked at him, her eyes as fierce as the fire in her forge. This place, this anvil, this fire, this is my ground. This forge is my second leg. Eamon, it's the one that holds me up. I will not let them take it. He saw the iron in her, the same unbending will that had refused to let a doctor take her leg, the same will that had forced her to walk. He knew that look, and he knew it was pointless to argue. He nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. All right, then we don't run. He looked back at the door. We fight, but this looks solid. It looks solid, Rowena said, a new, sharp edge in her voice. But it's not. It's a lie. She limped to the door and ran her own calloused fingertips over the wax seal. Her brow furrowed. It's wrong. Wrong. The seal. It's too clean. They waited until the deep, starless dark of 3 a.m. Mescal Flats was as quiet as a grave. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the empty structures. Eamon, moving with the silence of a shadow, didn't bother with the lock. He went to the alley side of the smithy, where a small, reinforced side door was built into the adobe. He used a pry bar, not as a weapon of force, but as a tool of persuasion, working the pins from the hinges. The sound was a dull, muffled groan of wood. They slipped inside. The forge was cold and smelled of dead embers in violation. Rowena lit a single oil lamp, the small flame pushing back the enormous darkness. Bring the light, she whispered. They went to the front doors. From the inside. Eamon held the lamp high. Rowena pulled a small, greasy black ledger from her workbench. This was her account book, but it was also her memory. She flipped past Mrs. Gable, 2 horseshoes, shod front and Mr. Miller, wagon wheel, rim reset. Tucked into the back cover was a stiff piece of cardstock. Glued to it was a small, perfect impression of the San Piedra territorial seal, made in black sealing wax. When I forged the new locks for Murdoch's jailhouse last year, she whispered, her voice trembling with the thrill of discovery. He had me test the new county press to make sure the die was clean. She held the card up, next to the chain that hung through the door handles. Eamon brought the lantern closer, their shoulders brushing in the cold. Look, she said, tracing the wax on the chain. It's a fake, a forgery. Eamon leaned in. It looks the same to me. No, look. Her finger, the nail permanently blackened with soot, pointed to the eagle's wing on her test seal. See here, the 3rd feather from the top. There's a tiny groove, a nick, a flaw in the original die. I remember noting it. Her finger moved to the bright red seal on the chain. This one, it's perfect. The lines are smooth. There's no flaw. She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the lantern light. Crane didn't just bribe Murdoch. He had a new false seal made. He's not just shutting me down. He's faking territorial authority to do it. He's in deeper than just a bribe. She went to her workbench, sat on her stool, and opened the ledger to a fresh page. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. By the light of the single lamp, she began to write. She documented the time, the method of entry, and with an engineer's precise hand, she sketched the two seals, side by side, noting the discrepancies. "Judge Larkins holds a town meeting every third Sunday, at the church," she said, not looking up. "That's in 4 days. Crane and Murdoch think they're just fighting a blacksmith. They're about to find out they're fighting a woman who keeps very, very good records." But Crane had not become a railroad agent by underestimating his opponents, or by leaving his flanks unguarded. He must have sensed that the simple act of condemnation had not broken Rowena. It had not sent her fleeing to the hills, so he moved to his next weapon, the one that worked faster than chains and more painfully than bribes shame. He loosed a rumor, like dropping a diseased rat into the town's well. The rumor found its full, ugly voice 2 nights later at the Copper Willow. Rowena had gone there, her ledger tucked under her arm, to find Elliot Sage, the mail courier. She needed to know if any packages, large enough to contain a metal die, had been delivered to Crane's depot. She was standing at the bar, trying to shout over the din of the piano, when one of Crane's hired men, a large, foul-smelling man who had helped nail the sign to her door, slammed his whiskey glass down. "Well, if it ain't the railroad's whore." The saloon didn't go quiet. It went silent. The piano player's hands froze. Every drinker, every gambler, every lost soul in the room turned to look. Rowena froze, the blood draining from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man, enjoying his newfound audience, swaggered toward her. "Oh, I think you do. Heard from Crane's man myself. Heard you went to him, private-like, after he shut you down. Offered a special discount." He grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Offered to trade favors for that big steel contract. Only Crane. He's a decent man. He turned you down, said the railroad doesn't do business with damaged goods." A low, cruel wave of laughter started at the back of the room. It was the same laughter that had haunted her since the accident. The gimp, crippled hen, damaged goods. But this was filth. This was an acid, designed to dissolve her reputation, her honor, the only things she had left. "That's a lie," Rowena said, but her voice was a strangled whisper. "Is it?" the man sneered, getting closer. "Or maybe you're just giving that horse breeder Pike the same deal. Is that how you get him to stand by you? A few free rides for some horseshoeing?" The saloon erupted. The laughter was a physical thing, sharp as metal shavings, stinging her eyes, her skin. She took an involuntary step back, her bad leg dragging on the floor, and the awkward, halting movement just made them laugh harder. She was trapped. "That's enough." The voice was not loud. It was a low, flat rumble that cut through the noise like a cold chisel. Eamon Pike was standing in the doorway. He had come in from the night, and he had brought the cold with him. He walked forward. He did not look at the thug. He did not look at the laughing men. He looked only at Rowena. He put his hand on her arm, his grip firm. "We're leaving." The thug, drunk on whiskey and his own power, stepped into their path. "This ain't your business, Pike. Me and the lady were just talking." Eamon stopped. He turned, very slowly, to face the man. The thug was a good 4 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier, all of it muscle and beer. Eamon just looked at him, his slate-gray eyes flat and empty of all emotion. "She's done talking," Eamon said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out of the way. Or what, horseman, you'll get your gimp to fight me." Eamon did not move. He did not tense. He simply said, "I'm going to walk out of this saloon. You can be standing, or you can be on the floor. It makes no difference to me, but you will move." The thug looked into Eamon's eyes and saw nothing he recognized. No anger, no fear. Just a deep, cold, bottomless patience. It was the patience of a man who waits for wild things to break themselves. The thug's smile faltered. He took half a step to the side. Eamon turned his back on the man. He put himself between Rowena and the rest of the saloon, his body a living shield. He kept his hand on her elbow, and he walked her out, his own steps deliberately slow, matching her halting pace. They stood on the warped porch, The cold night air a slap in the face. The wind was bitter, carrying the scent of pine. Behind them, the sounds of the saloon slowly started up again, but the laughter was gone. Rowena was shaking, a deep, shuddering tremor that started in her gut. I... She couldn't speak. She was drowning in shame and a rage so profound it choked her. Eamon just stood beside her, saying nothing, letting the silence and the cold do their work. "Why didn't you hit him?" she finally whispered, her voice thick. "Why did you let him say that?" "Because that's what he wanted," Eamon said, his gaze on the dark line of the mesas. "He wanted a fight. He wanted you arrested. He wanted to see you break." "You should have fought them," she insisted, needing the anger more than the logic. "You're not afraid of them." He turned to face her. The moonlight was thin, just enough to catch the hard planes of his face. "Rowena," he said, and his voice was rough, as if the words were hard to find. "I'm not a quick man with words. I'm not good at arguing. I'm not good in crowds. And I'm not good at this." He gestured vaguely at the saloon, at the town, at the whole ugly mess. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from rope burns and horseshoe nails. "But I'm good at standing beside." Rowena stopped shaking. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who had brought her tea, who had held the ladder in the rain, who had just walked into a room full of enemies and simply stood. She looked down at his hands. They were not the hands of a talker. They were the hands of a man who built things, who held things, who stayed. She reached out and put her own hand, stained with grease and soot, on top of his. His skin was rough, but warm. "That's enough," Rowena whispered. "That's more than enough." The sky to the north did not darken. It bruised. An ugly, deep purple-black mass of cloud began to swell over the peaks of Juniper Basin, blotting out the sun and swallowing the horizon. It was an unnatural color, a color that spoke of violence. The air, which had been hot and still, was suddenly sucked out of the valley, replaced by a strange, pressurized silence. The wind held its breath. Then, from the belly of the cloud, a flicker of white-hot light, and seconds later, the deep, guttural thump of distant thunder, like a giant closing a door. "That's not a rainstorm," Rowena said, her voice low. She was standing at the side door of her smithy, the one Eamon had unhinged and then set back in place. They had been inside for an hour, documenting the forged seal, and had come out for air. "That's an electrical storm, and it's coming fast." Eamon was already scanning the roof line of the forge. His eyes narrowed. "The west corner, the one we patched last time. It won't hold against a wind like that." The forge, her fortress, was now her greatest vulnerability. The sign on the front door was a paper tiger. But this storm was real, and it could do what Crane's men had not. It could destroy her. There was no discussion, no plan laid out in words. The time for that was over. Eamon turned and strode to the alley where the heavy, 20-foot extension ladder was chained to the wall. He snapped the cheap padlock with a single, sharp twist of a pry bar. He was a man of quiet, powerful efficiencies. He slung the ladder onto his broad back, the wood groaning under the sudden weight. Rowena was already moving, her limp more pronounced in her haste. Thump drag, fast as she could, to the lumber pile behind the forge. This was her boneyard, a collection of good, seasoned timber oak, pine, and cedar that she used for wagon frames and wheel spokes. She sorted through it with an expert's eye, discarding a piece with a hairline crack, another with a hidden knot. She selected 4 long, thick pine boards and a shorter, heavier piece of oak for a brace. She knelt in the dirt, the rising wind whipping her hair across her face, and began to tie the lumber into a manageable bundle with a length of thick sisal rope. Her hands were a blur, tying the knots with a speed that belied the ache in her leg. Eamon set the ladder against the west wall, the feet sinking into the dry, hard-packed earth. He didn't climb. He walked back to her. He didn't take the bundle, but instead went to his saddlebag, slung over the hitching post. He returned with his hammer. the one with the worn, smooth handle and the perfectly balanced head, and a pouch heavy with 4-inch nails. He walked to the base of the wall, and while she tied, he began to tap. Thud, thud, thud. He moved along the foundation, his head tilted, listening. He was testing the vertical supports, the main bones of the building, with rhythmic, percussive taps. He was listening for the dull, soft thunk of rot, the hollow sound of weakness. His face was a mask of concentration. He was a man reading a language written in wood. "The main beam is solid," he grunted, just as the first massive drops of rain, cold and heavy as coins, began to splat in the dust around them. "But the joist! It's loose!" The wind no longer whispered. It shrieked. A sudden violent gust ripped through the alley, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and grit, and then the sky tore open. Crack boom! A bolt of lightning, jagged and blinding, struck the ridgeline 100 yards away. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical blow. It was a punch to the chest that left them breathless. The air crackled, tasting of sulfur and burnt stone. At the same moment, the loose joist Eamon had found gave a loud, agonizing groan. A support strut, high up under the eave, slipped from its housing. A section of the roof, a good 10 by 10 square, visibly sagged. "It's going!" Rowena yelled over the rising roar. "The ladder!" Eamon was already there, holding the base of the ladder steady as the wind tried to wrestle it away from the wall. "I'll go." "No!" she shouted, shoving the oak X-brace into his hands. "You hold the joist, I'll set the brace, I know where it needs to go." She didn't wait for his argument. She stuffed her own smaller hammer into her belt, grabbed a fistful of nails, and started up the ladder. It was a nightmare of a climb. The wind was a solid, shoving hand, trying to peel her from the rungs. Her good leg pushed, her bad leg scraped and dragged, the ankle screaming as it failed to find purchase. Thump, scrape, push. The rain was coming in horizontal sheets now, cold and stinging, plastering her shirt to her back, blinding her. She was halfway up, maybe 10 feet off the ground, her world reduced to the slick, wet wood in her hands. She was breathing in ragged, painful gasps. Sweat and rain mingled, running into her eyes, blurring her vision. Eamon was above her, having scrambled up the wall like a mountain cat, his boots finding impossible holds in the adobe. He was straddling the peak, his legs locked, leaning down at a dangerous angle, his shoulder pressed against the sagging joist, his entire body straining to keep the roof from collapsing on top of them. "Now, Rowena!" he roared, his voice barely a whisper in the storm. "Set it." She reached the top of the ladder, her body shaking from the exertion, her leg a dead, agonizing weight. She saw where the brace had to go, a marriage of the main wall beam and the sagging roof joist. She hooked her bad leg around the ladder rung, a desperate, anchoring move, and leaned out, bracing herself with her good leg. She raised the X-brace. A sudden, hellish downdraft slammed into the wall. It was a fist of air, solid and malicious. It caught a stack of loose planks on the ground, 100-pound weight, and threw them into the air like paper. One heavy 12-foot plank of raw lumber was lifted, spun, and hurled directly at her. It was all happening in a terrible, slow-motion ballet. She saw the plank coming. She saw the splintered end aimed at her chest. She had no time to move, no time to even cry out. Eamon, from his precarious perch, saw it too. He couldn't stop the plank. He couldn't reach it. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic fury. He lunged. He didn't lunge at the plank. He lunged at her. In the fraction of a second before impact, his arm snaked out. He didn't grab her. He hit her, his hand, open and hard, slammed into her shoulder, pushing her backward. At the same instant, his other arm, the one not holding up the roof, wrapped around her waist. It was a band of iron. He yanked her off the ladder, pulling her bodily toward him, crushing her against the wall of the smithy. His body became her shield. The plank struck. It didn't hit her. It hit him. A glancing, brutal blow across his back and shoulder. The sound was a sickening, wet thwack. He grunted, a deep, painful sound, his body absorbing the entire, shattering impact. Everything stopped. For one single, crystallized moment. There was no storm. There was no rain. There was only the wall at her back, the crushing, protective weight of Eamon's arm around her waist, and his face, inches from hers. He was pinned between her and the plank, which was now wedged against the wall. He was breathing in great, ragged gasps, his eyes shut tight in pain. His breath, hot and tasting of the storm, hit her cheek. Her breath was caught in her throat, a trapped, terrified gasp. Their breaths collided, a visible plume of steam in the cold, driving rain. It was a shared, desperate spark of life. His eyes snapped open. They were slate gray, full of pain and something else, a fierce, protective fire. The moment broke. The plank, its momentum spent, clattered harmlessly to the ground. Eamon didn't let go. His arm was still locked around her. "The brace!" he gasped. The words ripped from his lips. The adrenaline, sharp and clear, cut through her shock. She understood. They were alive, and the job was not done. They found a rhythm then, a desperate, unspoken cadence. They were no longer two people, they were one machine, working against the clock of the storm. He held the sagging joist, his muscles screaming, his face pale with the pain of his shoulder. She, still pressed against him, her arm a prisoner, swung the hammer. She set the brace. She held, he nailed. She measured the angle, her eye an expert's. Yelling over the wind, he cut not with a saw, but with a hatchet he had on his belt, his chops quick and brutal, shaping the wood. She held the nail, her fingers numb, trusting him. He drove it. His hammer blows a steady, powerful counterpoint to the thunder. Bang, bang, bang. It was a soundtrack of trust, forged in chaos. The X-brace was in, the joist was secure, the sag was gone. "The peak!" Eamon yelled, pulling his arm from her waist and scrambling back up to the ridgepole. One more loose tin. Just as he reached the top, the deluge hit. The rain, which had been a mere assault, became an ocean. It was a solid, drowning wall of water. Inside, he roared, sliding down the roof. They didn't bother with the ladder. They half fell, half jumped into the deep, churning mud of the alley. They scrambled for the side door, a dark, welcoming hole. They tumbled inside, one after the other, into the pitch-black cold of the forge. Eamon shoved the heavy, unhinged door back into its frame. He grabbed the massive oak crossbar and dropped it into its iron brackets. Kathoom! The sound of the bar slamming home was the exact same sound as the world exploding. A bolt of lightning struck the anvil. Not the one inside, but the massive, 300-pound spare anvil that sat in the yard. The explosion was deafening, a flash of pure, blinding white light that filled the forge, followed by a shower of sparks and the smell of ozone and molten steel. The door slammed shut, the bar fell, and the world ended, all in the same, terrifying second. They were inside, in the dark. The only sound was the roar of the storm, a sound so loud it was physical, a vibration they felt in their bones, in their teeth, and under it, their own ragged, desperate breathing. Then, another sound, a low, steady whoosh, a sound of water moving, a sound of water draining. The new gutter Eamon had installed was working. The roof, the patch, the brace. It was all holding. Rowena fumbled for the workbench. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't find the matches. They were numb, caked in mud, useless. Shh! Eamon's voice came from the dark, close. A large, warm, impossibly steady hand covered hers. He took the matchbox from her trembling fingers. A scrape, a flare of sulfur and light. He lit the oil lamp. The wick caught, and a small, buttery yellow glow pushed back the absolute darkness. The light found them. They were a sight, soaked to the skin, plastered in mud, streaked with pine sap and soot. Water streamed from them, pooling at their feet. Rowena looked at the roof. It was dry. She looked at Eamon. His face was pale, his lip bleeding where he'd bitten it, but his eyes were alive. She started to shiver. It wasn't a small thing. It was a deep, violent, bone-rattling quake. It was the adrenaline draining away. It was the cold. It was the shock. It was the sudden, terrible, beautiful knowledge that they were alive. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the simple, brutal fact of survival. The roar of the storm did not vanish. It changed. The violent, crashing assault of the thunder and wind faded, replaced by a deep, steady, all-encompassing whoosh of heavy, unrelenting rain on the tin roof. It was no longer a threat. It was a blanket. It was a dense, liquid wall of sound that sealed them in, cutting them off from the rest of the world, from Mescal Flats, from Hollis Crane, from everything but the small, 10-foot circle of buttery light cast by the oil lamp. They stood, dripping, in the middle of the forge, the mud and water from their bodies forming a dark pool on the hard-packed earth floor. The only sound inside, beneath the roar of the rain, was the sound of their own breathing, raspy, wet, and unsteady. And the silence between those breaths, the small, empty spaces felt enormous, as if they had been hollowed out by the lightning. Rowena's shiver, the one that had started as a vibration of survival, was now a full, uncontrolled quake. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. The cold was inside her. It was the shock. It was the sudden, violent release of a tension that had been winding her tight for weeks. Eamon watched her. He was in no better shape. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming on his cheek where the plank had grazed him, and he held his left shoulder at a stiff, unnatural angle. He took a step toward her, his intention clear to move to the small cot in the back, to grab the dry, horsehair blanket he knew she kept there. Rowena saw the movement. She put out her hand. It was not a gesture to stop him. It was just an offering. She held it out between them in the yellow light. Her hand, which a few hours ago had been sketching evidence, was now a thing of raw, elemental truth. It was caked in mud, streaked with pine sap, and smeared with the fine, black glitter of iron filings from her hammer. A small cut on her knuckle was welling with a single drop of blood, bright red against the black. She was not asking for help. She was not asking for comfort. She was just showing him who she was. She was the mud. She was the iron. She was the blood. Eamon stopped, his gaze fixed on her hand. He did not look at her face. He looked at her hand. He was a man who understood hands. He understood the language of calluses, of scars, of the way a hand was shaped by its work. He did not take her hand. He did not try to clean it. He did not offer a bandage. He stepped forward, closing the last foot of space between them, and he gently, reverently, took her wrist. His grip was warm and solid. He lifted her hand, and he turned it over, and then he lowered his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, right on the torn, dirty knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a gesture of profound, aching respect. It was a wordless, sacramental thank you. A thank you for her courage. A thank you for her strength. A thank you for the forge that had sheltered them. A thank you for being alive. That single warm, gentle point of contact broke something deep inside Rowena. The shiver did not stop. It fractured. A single, hot tear. A tear of exhaustion and relief, not of sadness, escaped her eye. It traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She made a low sound in her throat, a sound of someone who had been holding her breath for a year. And then she moved. She stepped into him, into his space, into the solid, unyielding wall of his presence. She let her hand drop from his grasp, and she pressed her forehead against the center of his chest, right on his breastbone. She closed her eyes. The world vanished. The rain, the cold, the fear. It all went away, replaced by the reality of him. He was solid. He was warm. He was real. He smelled of rain, and horses, and the faint, sharp tang of ozone. She felt the damp, rough wool of his shirt against her skin, and beneath it, she felt the steady, powerful, reliable beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a good horse walking. It was the sound of a well-set hammer. It was the sound of something that would not break. She just stood there, leaning her weight on him, listening to him being alive, She felt him go utterly still. His whole body, from his shoulders to his knees, tensed. His breath caught in his throat. He did not put his arms around her. His hands, large and scarred, hovered at his sides, open and empty. He was a man on a precipice, terrified of making the wrong move, terrified of presuming, terrified of breaking this fragile, sacred silence. He stood frozen, a statue of pure, respectful hesitation. She could feel his dilemma in the way his muscles were coiled. He was giving her the choice. He would not take it. Rowena did not lift her head. She did not want to see his face. She wanted to stay right here, in this blind, safe, dark. She just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement, her forehead pressing yes into his chest. Yes, it is all right. Stay. It was permission. It was an invitation. It was a surrender. The breath he had been holding escaped him in a long, shaky sigh that she felt as much as heard. It was the sound of a man letting go of a heavy weight. And then his arms came up, slowly, so slowly, as if he were gentling a spooked colt. His hands, large and warm, did not grab her. They settled, carefully, on her shoulders. He just held her, his thumbs pressing gently into the hollows of her collarbones. Then, with a rough, clumsy tenderness, his fingers found the top button of her soaked, heavy canvas jacket. He fumbled with it. His hands, so sure on a rein or a hammer, were awkward. His knuckles brushed the skin of her neck, and a small spark, completely different from the lightning, jumped between them. He undid the first button, then the second. He peeled the heavy, wet jacket from her shoulders, his hands sliding down her arms. He was as gentle as if he were unstringing a high-tensioned bow, easing the strain so it would not snap. The jacket fell with a wet, heavy thud to the floor. She was left in her thin, damp cotton undershirt. The cold, lamplit air of the forge touched her skin, and a new shiver, one that had nothing to do with the rain, ran through her. He stepped back just enough to shrug out of his own soaked coat, his face tight with pain as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. As the coat fell away, his damp shirt pulled taut across his back, and she saw it in the flickering light, a long, puckered, silvery line. It was an old scar, running from the top of his shoulder down toward his ribs. It was a story of a long-ago winter, of a bad fall, of a deep wound that had healed, but had left its mark, a part of his own silent history. Rowena lifted her hand, the one he had kissed, and with a courage that was different from the courage of the storm, she reached out. She laid her fingers, light as a feather, directly on the scar, tracing its path through the damp cotton. He flinched, a sharp, sudden intake of breath, a tightening of his entire body. But he did not pull away. He held still, letting her touch his old, healed pain. And in that moment, they began to speak a new language. His hand, the one that was not on his injured shoulder, moved. It slid from her shoulder, down her arm, and found its way to the small of her back. It was not a lover's caress. It was a builder's hand. It was a hand that offered support, that offered balance. It anchored her. It said, "I am here. I will not let you fall." He leaned his head down, and, mirroring her earlier gesture, he rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that for a long moment, eye to eye, breath to breath. His eyes were closed. They just breathed in the shared, warm air between them. She felt the brush of his eyelashes against her skin. She felt the warmth radiating from him. She tilted her head, just a fraction, a small, instinctive shift, and her lips brushed the rough, stubbled line of his jaw. He turned his head, his lips, chapped from the wind and the rain, met hers. It was not a kiss of fire. It was a kiss of embers. It was slow and hesitant and profoundly gentle. It was a kiss of discovery. It tasted of the storm, of rain and iron and soot, and underneath it all, a deep, surprising warmth. It was a long, unhurried, searching kiss that spoke of patience, of banked heat, of a relief so total that it was its own kind of ache. He pulled back, just an inch, just enough to see her face. His hand came up from her back to cup her jaw. his thumb brushing away the tear track on her cheek. His other hand, his calloused, scarred, worker's hand, cradled her head as if she were made of spun glass. Their bodies were pressed close, from knee to chest. He was accepting her weight. He could feel the awkward, stiff brace of her bad leg against his. But he did not shift. He did not accommodate it. He simply accepted it as part of her. He looked into her eyes, and in the dim, yellow light, she saw his own vulnerability. The man who was a rock, the man who was a shield, was now open. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, raw-edged rasp, a sound barely louder than the rain. "Rowena," he breathed. "Is this all right?" He was giving her all the power. He was not the thug in the saloon. He was not Crane. He was Eamon, the man who brought tea, the man who held ladders, the man who had just used his own body as a shield. And he was asking. A slow, weary, impossibly warm smile spread across Rowena's face. It was the first true smile she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. It lit her from the inside out. "I choose you, Eamon," she whispered. That was all. That was everything. The breath he'd been holding whooshed out of him, and he kissed her again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of acceptance, of shared burdens, of a promise made and kept. It was a kiss that said, "I see you, I see all of you, and I am not afraid." He gathered her closer, his good arm locking around her waist, and he lifted her, just slightly, taking her full weight, letting her bad leg hang free, unburdened. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on, not in fear, but in arrival. Outside, the storm had passed. The thunder was a low, distant grumble, miles away, bothering some other valley. The rain had softened from a deluge to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, a sound not of anger, but of cleansing. Inside, in the small, warm circle of the lamp, they had tied an invisible knot. It was not a knot of sudden, fiery passion, but of something far stronger, something that would last. It was a knot woven of respect and shared survival, and a deep, profound, and gentle agreement. He held her, and she held him. They were two damaged, stubborn, unbending things, two pieces of steel that had been through the fire and the water, and as they stood together, anchored in the heart of the cold, safe forge, they were not broken. They were tempered, and they were, at last, ready. The morning after the storm was unnervingly clean. The rain had washed the air, stripping it of dust, leaving behind the sharp, wet scents of creosote bush and damp earth. The sky was a high, pale blue, and the world seemed newly made. But inside the forge, the cold reality of their fight had returned with the light. Eamon's shoulder was a deep, mottled purple, swollen and stiff, but he refused to rest. Rowena, after 4 hours of sleep on her cot, her body a map of new aches, felt a clarity she hadn't had before. The intimacy of the night had not softened her. It had annealed her. It had taken her fear and burned it away, leaving a core of pure, cold resolve. While Eamon, moving stiffly, saw to his horse and then began clearing the debris the storm had scattered across her yard, Rowena went to work. She unlocked the heavy, iron-banded chest where she kept her most valuable tools. But she wasn't looking for a hammer. She was looking for a small, leather-bound notebook. It had belonged to Jedediah Croft, the old county clerk, a meticulous, fussy man who had passed away 2 winters ago. Rowena had forged the complex locking mechanism for Croft's private document safe, and he had paid her not in cash, but with a stack of high-quality Swedish steel rods and, strangely, his old, retired territorial seal press. "It's obsolete, my dear," he'd fussed. "But the craftsmanship is sound, a curiosity." Rowena had never used the press, but she had kept the notebook that came with it. Croft had been a man of obsessive detail. Tucked in the back, just as she remembered, was the page. August 14th, 1872. Final test of the San Piedra territorial die, before lodging with sheriff's office. And below it, a perfect, sharp impression in black wax. She carried it to the workbench, placing it beside the card she had from her own test, and beside that, she placed the crude, red wax forgery from her front door. Eamon came inside, wiping mud from his hands, drawn by her silence. He stood beside her, in the clean morning light. The difference was stark. It was exactly as she'd thought. The forgery was smooth, almost new, the details the eagle's eye, the lettering slightly thick, but the official seal, both her test and Croft's, had the flaw, a tiny hairline sliver, a mistake in the die, right on the third wing feather. "It's proof," Eamon said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a proof," Rowena corrected, her mind already moving to the next step. "It proves this is a fake. It doesn't prove who faked it." She needed more. She needed a chain. She went back to her main ledger, the black oil-stained book where she kept her sketches and her accounts. She sat on her stool, her bad leg propped up, and began to turn the pages, not looking for numbers, but for patterns. "Crane is a creature of paper," she said, thinking aloud. "He came here with papers. He threatened me with papers. He used a paper sign and a fake seal." She tapped the ledger. "Men like that, they can't help themselves. They leave a trail of ink." She scanned her own accounts. Harness repair for Miller's freight line, 2 new sets of shoes for the stagecoach, new branding iron for the Pike Hollow Ranch. She stopped. Her finger rested on an entry from 3 weeks ago. A bill from Breyer Sons, the main mercantile in town, for a case of lamp oil and 3 kegs of blasting powder. It was a standard order. But as she looked at the invoice, a small, nagging detail she had dismissed at the time came rushing back. "Eamon," she said, her voice sharp. "Come here. Look at this signature." He leaned over her shoulder, so close she could feel the warmth from his body, his gaze following her finger. The invoice was signed by Harlan Breyer, the owner, H. Breyer. "Harlan's a friend," she said. "I've seen his signature 100 times. He signs his R with a sharp, straight-down stroke. Always. He says it's faster." She pointed to the invoice. "Look at this R. It's looped. It's a schoolboy's loop. This is not Harlan's signature, but it's just a bill for oil," Eamon said, not seeing it. "Is it?" Rowena said, her mind racing. "This was the same week Crane surveyors were inspecting my forge for fire hazards. This invoice. This is for a shipment I never received. Someone was building a case, a false paper trail, to prove I was stocking explosive materials improperly, to make the condemned order look legal." "Crane," Eamon said. "The word a curse. Or Murdoch," Rowena said. "It doesn't matter. They're the same animal now." She had the how the forged seal. She had the motive the railroad. She had the method a false paper trail. Now she needed the link. How did Crane get the fake, custom-made dye? It had to be shipped. "Elliot Sage," Eamon said, reading her mind. Elliot Sage was the mail courier, a wiry, nervous man who moved in a permanent cloud of road dust and anxiety. His job depended on the goodwill of every major player in the territory, from the ranchers to the land agents. He was, by nature, a man who saw nothing, heard nothing, and kept his mouth shut. They found him at the livery, sorting mail bags in the back of his buggy. "Mr. Sage," Rowena said, her voice polite but firm. He jumped, dropping a bundle of letters. "Miss Vale, Mr. Pike. Terrible storm. Just terrible. Lots of washouts on the North Road." He was already backing away, his eyes darting to Eamon's bruised face and stiff shoulder. "We need to see your delivery ledger, Elliot," Eamon said, his voice flat. He didn't ask. He stated. He used his bulk to block the path to the buggy. "Oh, I can't do that," Sage stammered, wringing his hands. That's federal mail. That's private. I could lose my job. I could go to jail." "You could," Rowena agreed, stepping forward into the light. Her bad leg made its familiar thump-drag sound on the wooden boards. "Or," she continued, "you could be the man who let a forged territorial seal be used to steal land from the people of this town. A seal used on my door. A seal that will be presented to Judge Larkins on Sunday, and he will want to know how it got here." She was bluffing. She had no idea if Larkins would listen, but Sage didn't know that. He looked from Rowena's cold, angry eyes to Eamon's silent, immovable form. He was trapped between a rock and a hard place. I ain't seen no seals," he whispered, his face pale. "We're not looking for a seal, Elliot," Eamon said, his voice softening just a fraction. "We're looking for a package. A small, heavy package. Shipped from, say, Denver or Santa Fe. Addressed to Hollis Crane. Or maybe just to the Crane Depot. About 3-4 weeks back." Sage's eyes widened. He knew. "I just deliver," he pleaded. "Show us the book," Rowena said. "Show us, and you're just a mailman doing your job. Don't show us, and you're part of a conspiracy to commit fraud against the territory. I wonder how Judge Larkins will feel about that." The word conspiracy broke him. With a shaking hand, he pulled a thick dog-eared ledger from under the buggy seat. 3 weeks ago, you say," he mumbled, his finger running down the cramped, inky lines. Just a quick look." He stopped. His finger froze. "April 17th, 1 crate, 20 pounds. From Denver Engraving Company. Addressed to H. Crane Depot." He didn't have to show them. The look of pure animal terror on his face was enough. I gotta go," Sage said, slamming the book shut. "The North Road. I'm late." He scrambled into his buggy, snapped the reins, and rattled out of the livery yard as if the devil himself were at his heels. Rowena and Eamon just looked at each other. "Denver Engraving Company," Eamon said. "He'll be at the bottom of a bottle by sundown." Rowena said, "But we have it. We have the chain." They went back to the forge. The sun was high now, and the air was hot and humid, steaming the last of the rain from the ground. Rowena grabbed a piece of white chalk, the kind she used for marking steel. She went to her largest, flattest anvil, its surface worn smooth and dark from a decade of her hammer. She drew a box, Crane Depot. She drew another, Sheriff Murdoch. A third, Railroad Committee. Then she drew the arrows. An arrow from Denver Engraving Company to Crane Depot. And she wrote, "Forged die." An arrow from Crane Depot to Sheriff Murdoch. And she wrote, "Bribe plus false seal." An arrow from Murdoch to her forge. And she wrote, "Condemned sign." She drew a new line, from H. Breyer, Mercantile. And next to it, "Forged invoice." That arrow pointed to Murdoch, 2. And then she drew 1, big arrow from all of it. And it pointed to Hollis Crane and the Railroad Committee. It was a map of a crime, written in white chalk on a block of black steel. "This," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, controlled fury, "is what we show the judge." Judge Everett Larkins was a man who believed in the law, but he was not a fool. He was also a political creature, and he understood power. The Silver Comet Railroad had more power in a single office in Denver than he had in his entire territory. They met him in his dusty, book-filled chambers, the air thick with the smell of old paper and tobacco. Rowena had copied her diagram and her notes onto a clean sheet of paper. Larkins read it. He put on his spectacles and read it again. He looked at the perfect wax seal from Croft's notebook. He looked at Rowena's meticulous, hand-drawn sketch of the forgery. He frowned. It was a deep, troubled frown. "This is a serious allegation, Miss Vale." "It is a serious crime, Judge," Rowena said. "He forged the territorial seal. He bribed the sheriff. He faked evidence. He's trying to steal my land. You have assumptions," Larkins said, tapping the paper. "You assume the package from Denver contained a die. You assume Harlan Breyer's signature was forged. It is compelling, but it is not definitive. And the threat, Judge." Eamon spoke for the first time, his voice filling the small room. "The threat to burn her out, the threat of safety inspections, that's not an assumption. I heard it." Larkins sighed. He took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Hollis Crane is a representative of the railroad. Mr. Pike, the railroad is important. It's the future. This territory needs it. If I move against him, if I make this public, and I am wrong, and if you are right, Rowena cut in. And you do nothing. What kind of future is that? A future where any man with a polished coat can forge the law and steal what he wants? The judge looked at her, his eyes weary. I will look into it, he said, the words of a man buying time. Discreetly. I will send a telegraph to Denver. I will speak to Harlan Breyer, but I need time. He was stalling. He was afraid. The pressure of the railroad was too much for him. They left the office, walking out into the bright, hot afternoon. The victory of the morning felt hollow. Hollis Crane did not wait. He had seen them go into the judge's chambers. He knew he had been exposed, and he knew that a cornered animal is most dangerous. He did not need to be discreet. He needed to be overwhelming. He counterattacked. The next morning, the day of the weekly town market, a new notice was posted, not just on her door, but in the saloon, on the mercantile, on the preacher's church. It was an emergency warrant, signed by Sheriff Murdoch, and, to Rowena's sickening surprise, co-signed by Judge Larkins. It declared Rowena Vale's smithy a clear and present public danger. It cited improper storage of blasting powder and reckless endangerment. It authorized the sheriff to conduct an immediate and full search of the premises and to seize any and all materials deemed hazardous. It was a trap. Crane, using the forged oil invoice as his proof, had forced Larkins's hand. The judge, to appear impartial, had signed it. Crane would use the warrant to send Murdoch in. Murdoch's men would find the blasting powder that Rowena had never ordered, which Crane's men had no doubt planted. She would be arrested. Her land would be seized. It was all legal. By 10 o'clock, the market was in full swing. The street was crowded, and in front of Rowena's forge, Sheriff Murdoch and 3 of his thuggish, newly hired deputies were preparing to smash the side door. "This is a legal warrant. Miss Vale," Murdoch shouted. "Stand aside." Rowena stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her ledger was tucked in her belt. "You are not entering. Sheriff, this warrant is based on a lie. That's for the judge to say." Murdoch sneered. "Now move, or I'll arrest you for obstructing justice." A crowd had gathered. They were arranged in a half-moon, a clear line drawn in the dust. On one side were the saloon men, Crane's associates, and the curious, all of them whispering, some of them smirking, waiting for the gimp to finally be put in her place. On the other side were a few silent watchers. Miller, the freighter, Harlan Breyer, his face a mask of fury, and a few of the small ranchers who Crane had also pressured. They were quiet and afraid. "I said move." Murdoch put his hand on her shoulder to shove her. Before his hand could land, Eamon Pike's horse, Kestrel, stepped sideways. Kestrel was a big, intelligent animal, and he moved with a sudden, intimidating grace. Eamon, in the saddle, had moved him to block the door. His horse was now a living wall, separating Murdoch from Rowena. Eamon looked down, not at Murdoch, but at the crowd. "This is not a search," Eamon said, his voice carrying in the sudden, tense silence. "It's a theft." "That's Pike," someone yelled. "He's in on it with her. He's just trying to get her land," another sneered. Repeating Crane's rumor, Murdoch put his hand on his gun. "Pike, that's interfering with a territorial officer. Get that horse out of my way, or I'll put a bullet in it." The crowd gasped. Eamon's hand moved, just slightly, toward his own rifle, which was in its saddle scabbard. "No!" Rowena's voice was a cry. She pushed past the horse, placing herself between Murdoch's gun and Eamon. She looked at the crowd, at the sneering faces, and at the fearful, hesitant ones. She knew, in that instant, that Judge Larkins's dusty room was not where this would be won. The law was not in his books. It was here, in the dust, in front of all of them. She unhooked her ledger from her belt. She held it up, high, for everyone to see. "You want to know what's in my forge?" she shouted, her voice ringing with a power no one had ever heard from her. You want to know about public dangers, I'll show you. She pointed not at her forge, but at the open-air town square at Dry Creek Crossing, 100 yards away. I am not a criminal, I'm a citizen of this territory, and I'm being robbed. I call for a public hearing right now. Here in the square, where there are no back rooms, no locked doors, and no shadows. She turned to Murdoch, her eyes blazing. You want to search my property. Sheriff, you can... But first, you and Hollis Crane and Judge Larkins are going to listen to me. You are all going to look at my evidence. She turned to the crowd, her voice raw. I will lay out the truth on my anvil, in the sun, for all to see. And you will all be the jury. Let's see if a forged lies is heavier than a pound of good, honest steel. Rowena's challenge hung in the hot, crowded air, as stark and sharp as a new forged blade. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the jeers and whispers had been. Sheriff Murdoch's hand froze, hovering over the butt of his pistol. His face, which had been a mask of sneering authority, was now a confused jumble of anger and uncertainty. The crowd was not on his side. They were not on Rowena's side. They were simply waiting. They had been offered a show, and now they intended to see it. Eamon's horse, Kestrel, shifted under him. The creak of leather a loud, solitary sound in the quiet. He kept the stallion between Murdoch and Rowena, a silent, unmoving guardian. Hollis Crane, who had been observing from the porch of the Mercantile, his thin lips pressed into a self-satisfied smile, now looked displeased. This was not the quick, surgical removal he had planned. This was a spectacle. This is not a courtroom, Miss Vale, Murdoch finally blustered, finding his voice. This is an official warrant. Now stand aside. Fire! The word cut through the tension like an axe. It was a high, thin scream from a boy on the edge of the crowd, his finger pointing not at the forge, but to the southeast. Fire out by the gulch! It's a big one! Every head turned. A thick, greasy pillar of black smoke was climbing into the pale blue sky, churning and boiling, a foul stain on the clean morning. It was coming from the old switchyard, from the cluster of abandoned warehouses that lined Switchyard Gulch, the very same warehouses Hollis Crane had leased for his depot. Rowena's head snapped toward the smoke, and then, instantly, back to Eamon. Their eyes met over the heads of the crowd. No words were needed. It was an explosion of shared, sickening understanding. The forged die, the engraving kit from Denver, the false invoices, the evidence. He's burning it, Rowena breathed, the words a hollow punch to her own gut. Crane wasn't just trying to frame her. He was destroying his own trail. Murdoch, Crane's voice was suddenly sharp, panicked. Secure this hazard, that is your duty. He was trying to reestablish control, to keep the sheriff occupied, to buy the fire time, but Eamon was already moving. He was not a man for panic, but for action. Rowena, he yelled. And it was not a question. It was a command. He wheeled Kestrel, the big horse rearing for a half-second, scattering the crowd, and then he was gone. A thunder of hooves, kicking up a cloud of dust as he took the straightest possible line toward the smoke. Murdoch, torn between his orders, his warrant, and this new public disaster, hesitated. That hesitation cost him. Rowena did not wait. She turned and ran. Thump drag, as fast as she could move, her bad leg a fiery, rebellious anchor. She ran to the hitching post where her own horse, Sable, a small, sturdy, brown mare, was tied. She did not have Eamon's grace. The mount was a clumsy, painful scramble. She had to use the rail to pull herself up, her leg refusing to bend. But she swung herself into the old, worn saddle. She kicked Sable into a run. The mare, though not as fast as Kestrel, was strong and sure-footed. She flew past the stunned crowd, past the fumbling, shouting deputies, past the look of pure, cold fury on Hollis Crane's face. The race was on. The entire town, as if pulled by an invisible string, began to move. Men scrambled for horses, wagons, or simply began to run, following the two riders and the plume of smoke. This was no longer about a legal dispute. It was about a fire, a chase, and the promise of a reckoning. Rowena pushed Sable hard. Eamon, on his faster horse, had already pulled ahead, a dark speck against the pale grass. But then he slowed, just enough. He held Kestrel back to a pounding, ground-eating canter, letting Rowena catch up. He rode beside her, not in front of her. His body, his horse, was a moving shield, a barrier between her and the world. They pounded across the open flats, the smoke growing thicker, the acrid, chemical smell of it stinging their nostrils. They were a mile out of town when they reached the lip of Switchyard Gulch. The gulch was a deep, 50-foot scar in the earth, a dry arroyo with steep, gravelly sides. The only way across was a long-abandoned, rotting wooden trestle bridge, built for ore carts that no longer ran. The depot, now a roaring inferno, was on the other side, but something was wrong. Halfway across the bridge, a heavy freight wagon, its bed loaded with barrels, was in terrible trouble. One of the rear wheels had punched clean through a rotten support plank. The wagon was tilted at a terrifying 45-degree angle, balanced like a child's toy. On the edge of the chasm, the team of 4 horses, braying in terror, was pulling forward, while the wagon's weight was pulling them, inch by inch, backward, toward the drop. Whoa, back Hold'em, the teamster, a big man on the buckboard, was screaming, his voice cracking with panic. Then Rowena saw it. It was a boy, no older than 10, the teamster's son perhaps. He had been on the back of the wagon, and when it had tilted, he had fallen. His foot was caught, tangled in a coil of thick rope that had spilled from the wagon bed. He was dangling, a small, twisting figure, suspended in the air between the collapsing bridge and the hard, rocky bottom of the gulch, his weight pulling the rope taut from the wagon's side. "Pa, help me, it's tight, I'm stuck." I can't," the father screamed, "fighting the horses. If I move, we all go." The crowd from Mescal Flats was just now cresting the hill behind them. They were arriving just in time to see the catastrophe. Eamon was already off Kestrel, his eyes on the fire, his mind on the evidence. "The depot," he grunted. "We have to—" "The boy!" Rowena screamed, her voice a raw shriek. "Eamon, the rope!" She didn't wait for him. She threw herself from Sable's back, landing hard. The shock of the impact sent a white-hot bolt of agony up her bad leg, but she ignored it. She looked at the bridge, at the boy, and at the steep, unstable gravel bank of the ravine. She couldn't get to him from the bridge. The wagon was in the way. She had to go under. She half ran, half limped to the edge of the ravine, and, without a second's hesitation, threw herself over the side. She didn't climb. She slid. She dug in her heels and her hands, her good leg working like a piston, her bad leg dragging, useless. Thump drag, thump drag. She was a cloud of dust and falling rock, her only goal to get under the boy, to take his weight, to stop the rope from cutting him in half. The crowd on the ridge gasped. They saw her, the gimp, the cripple, the woman they had mocked, scrambling down a cliff face while the men stood frozen, watching. Eamon saw her. He saw the fire, the evidence, the burning depot. He saw the boy, and he saw Rowena, her face a mask of iron will, about to get herself killed. She was 10 feet from the bottom when the loose gravel she was counting on gave way. Her bad leg, which she'd put weight on by mistake, twisted under her. A sharp, piercing cry, a gasp of pure pain, was ripped from her throat. She slipped. She was falling, tumbling, her last, desperate grab at the bank failing. Eamon moved. It was a choice made in the space of a heartbeat. The evidence, the fire, Crane. It could all wait. He launched himself from the ridge. It was not a fall. It was a leap, a controlled, powerful explosion of motion. He didn't slide. He jumped, his long legs taking in the angle, his boots hitting the gravel slope and digging in, using the momentum to ski down the bank. He was a force of nature, an anchor. He reached the bottom just as Rowena was tumbling past him. He shot out one arm, a band of steel, and caught her around the waist, pulling her back against the solid wall of the ravine. her body slamming into his. At the exact same instant, he reached up with his other, grabbing the dangling, kicking boy around the chest. "Hold still, son!" he roared. He yanked, and with a grunt of pure, raw strength, he freed the boy's foot from the tangled rope. He pinned them both against the rock face, his body a living shield, covering them. Rowena hold. On. Crack. The sound was a cannon shot. The wagon, its last connection to the bridge severed, finally gave way. The entire structure, the wagon, the barrels, the 4 screaming horses, and half the trestle bridge collapsed into the gulch. It was a thunderous, splintering, catastrophic explosion of wood, horseflesh, and dust. The debris rained down, a heavy beam crashing to the earth not 10 feet from where they stood. And then, silence. A thick, choking cloud of dust filled the ravine, blotting out the sun. The crowd on the rim was frozen, struck dumb by what they had just witnessed. Slowly, the dust began to settle. The first thing they saw was Eamon Pike, pressed flat against the rock. His face was grim, his eyes closed, his body tight. Then they saw he was not alone. He held Rowena Vale crushed against his chest, her face buried in his shoulder, her arms locked around his neck, and tucked under his other arm, crying but alive, was the boy. Eamon had saved them both. Rowena, who had gone first, was safe. The murmuring that started in the crowd now was different. It was not the sound of mockery. It was a low, stunned murmur of awe. Eamon opened his eyes. He coughed, the dust thick in his throat. He looked at Rowena. "You all right?" She just nodded, unable to speak, her face white with shock and pain. He gently set her on her feet, his arm staying around her, taking her weight as her bad leg buckled. He handed the crying boy up to his father, who had scrambled down the bank, his face a mask of tears. "The depot," Eamon said, his voice a raw rasp. He looked at the burning building, now cut off by the destroyed bridge. "We have to go back," Rowena whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to go around." They scrambled back up the bank, Eamon all but carrying her. They ran, back across the flats, to the narrow, shallow crossing a quarter-mile down. The crowd, Murdoch, and even Judge Larkins, who had arrived in his buggy, followed. They reached the burning depot. The roof had caved in, but the back storeroom, a separate structure of stone, was not yet fully consumed. Eamon kicked the door off its hinges, and a wave of superheated smoke rolled out. "Stay here," he yelled at Rowena. "The hell I will." She coughed, pulling the kerchief from her neck, dunking it in a water barrel by the door, and tying it over her face. She followed him in, her limp a steady, determined rhythm in the chaos. Thump drag, thump drag. Inside, it was a vision of hell, but in the back corner, just as they thought, was the evidence. A heavy wooden crate, its lid forced open with a crowbar, lay on its side, and stenciled in black paint property of SC Company, Denver, Silver Comet Company. Inside, nestled in burnt straw, was a heavy, cast-iron die press. A smaller, tin box beside it held a set of polished steel stamps and an open can of thick, black engraver's ink, its contents still gleaming, wet. "Eamon," Rowena said, her voice muffled by the cloth. She touched the face of the die, a perfect, smooth eagle. "It's still wet. The ink, they weren't just burning it, they were using it, making new forgeries." "There they are. Seize them. They started the fire." Sheriff Murdoch, his face a grotesque mask of soot and panic, burst through the smoke, his deputies right behind him. He saw the crate, and his eyes went wide. "That's evidence. It's mine. Give it to me." He lunged for the die. "That is quite enough. Sheriff Murdoch." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the roar of the fire with the clean, cold authority of a judge's gavel. Judge Larkin stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands clenched. He had seen the rescue at the bridge. He had seen the terror on Murdoch's face. The pressure of the railroad no longer mattered. "I will not," the judge said, his voice shaking with a cold, righteous anger. Have this circus, in my territory. I will not have evidence seized by the very man implicated in its creation. He pointed a finger at Murdoch. You, sir, are relieved of your duties, pending a full investigation. He then looked at Rowena and Eamon. Miss Vale, Mr. Pike, step away from the crate. He turned to Harlan Breyer, the mercantile owner, who stood in the crowd. Mr. Breyer, you are an honest man. You and I will inventory the contents of this box. Here, now, in front of all these witnesses. The judge pulled a small, silver fob from his pocket, his own personal seal. And we will seal it, not with a forged die, but with the true, legal mark of the San Piedra Territorial Court. And so, in the smoking, crackling ruins of the depot, surrounded by the entire stunned populace of Mescal Flats, the public hearing Rowena had demanded began. The judge, his face illuminated by the flames, simply pointed to Eamon. Mr. Pike, tell me what you know. Eamon Pike, his shirt torn, his face bruised, his good arm still protectively near Rowena, spoke. His voice was low and flat, and everyone strained to hear it. Heard Crane threaten her with fire, saw the fake seal on her door, watched Crane buy Murdoch in the saloon, saw the smoke, followed, found this. It was a handful of words. It was a hammer, driving a nail, straight and true. The judge nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. He turned to Rowena, who was standing, her ledger in her hand, her bad leg braced, her face black with soot. Miss Vale, the judge said, his voice softer now, the technical details, if you please. Rowena stepped forward. She was not the gimp. She was not the blacksmith. She was the truth. She pointed to the die in the box. That, she said, her voice clear and ringing, is the forgery. Look, the third feather on the wing is smooth. It has no flaw. The original die has a nick. I have the proof. She pointed to the can of ink. That ink is still wet. They were not burning evidence. Judge, they were interrupted while making more. They were going to steal all of it. She looked at the crowd, at the men who had mocked her, at the women who had pitied her. The truth, she said, when it's made of steel and covered in ink, doesn't need much talking. It just is. And this. She tapped the crate. Is it? The fire at the depot was a contained, smoking ruin. The sun was beginning its long, brutal descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red, the same colors as the dying embers. The entire population of Mescal Flats, it seemed, had reconvened in the central square, a patch of dusty, open ground between the mercantile and the church. It was not a formal court, but it had become one. The townspeople forming a silent, expectant ring. Judge Larkin stood on the church steps, a crate from the depot at his feet, sealed with his own silver-fobbed wax. Sheriff Murdoch and his deputies were there, but they were not in charge. They stood near the edge, disarmed and under the watchful eye of two burly freighters whom the judge had deputized on the spot. Rowena and Eamon stood in the center, near the town's dry, cracked horse trough. They were still covered in soot, smoke, and the grime of the ravine. Rowena's bad leg was screaming, a high, thin note of agony that she was barely able to wall off. Eamon's shoulder was a swollen, immobile mass, but he stood tall, his good arm resting lightly on the small of her back, a simple, steadying pressure. And then Hollis Crane appeared. He was not under arrest. He had not fled. He walked into the center of the square, his black frock coat still immaculate. He had washed his face. He looked, as always, like a man above the grit of the world. He was a man who knew the law was a tool, and he was about to try and wield it one last time. This, Crane said, his voice not loud, but smooth and carrying in the evening air, is a travesty. He pointed a thin, manicured finger, not at the judge, but at Rowena and Eamon. He knew his case in the law was lost. His only remaining weapon was the one he had tried to use in the saloon. Shame. You are all being fooled, he announced, his voice oozing a false, pitying sympathy. Fooled by a desperate woman and a simple-minded opportunist. A low, angry rumble started in Eamon's chest, his hand at his side. clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. "You see this woman?" Crane continued, turning his full, dramatic attention to Rowena, who flinched. "And you see a victim. She limps," he said, the word a poisoned dart. "And she holds up a forged ledger. And you believe her. She trades on that limp. She has used her weakness to solicit your pity, to avoid her legal responsibilities, to inflame you all into this mob." "That's a lie." Harlan Breyer, the mercantile owner, shouted from the crowd. "We saw the die." "Did you?" Crane smiled, a thin, reptilian movement of his lips. "Or did you see what she told you to see? And what of him?" He swung his arm, the dramatic gesture of a stage actor, toward Eamon. "This quiet, noble horse breeder? Do you really believe he is here out of some sense of justice? Or do you see the truth? He's a rancher with no water, standing next to a woman who owns the deed to the only working well in Dry Creek Crossing. This isn't justice. This is a land grab." He took a step closer to them, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, ugly sneer. "He's not marrying for love. He's marrying for the land, and she is desperate enough to give it to him. This entire charade was nothing more than a way to secure a title. She is a cripple, and he is a pauper, and together they have played you all for fools." The punch landed. It was brutal, and it was public. Rowena's face, already pale beneath the soot, went ashen. She visibly swayed, the accusation hitting her harder than the runaway freight wagon ever had. He had taken her deepest, most private fears, that she was a burden, that she was damaged goods, and had shouted them into the town square. Eamon's control broke. He let go of Rowena and took one long, fast step toward Crane, his good arm raised, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. "You!" he roared, the word a guttural explosion. "Eamon, no!" Rowena's voice was a knife, sharp and clear. He froze, his fist still in the air. He was trembling, every muscle in his body coiled to strike. She reached out and grabbed his arm, her small, soot-covered hand locking onto his thick, muscled forearm. He was like a taut-strung bow, and she was the only thing holding the arrow. He turned to look at her, his eyes wild. "Don't!" she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "This isn't his fight. It's ours. We don't win with shouting. Eamon." "We win with proof. We win by standing." He looked at her, at the iron in her eyes, the very thing he had come to love. The rage did not vanish, but he banked it. He walled it off, just as she walled off her pain. He slowly, agonizingly, lowered his arm. He stepped back beside her, but he did not touch her. He stood beside her, a silent, vibrating column of fury. "Thank you, Mr. Crane," Judge Larkin said, his voice so cold it seemed to steam in the hot air. "You have illuminated your character for the court. Now, if you are quite finished slandering the two people who just saved a boy's life, I will proceed." Crane's smile vanished. He had played his last card, and it had been trumped. The judge stepped forward. He held up the inventory sheet he and Harlan Breyer had compiled. "The contents of the crate, marked SC Company, are as follows." He read, his voice ringing out. 1. A cast iron manual die press. 2. A tin of blank wax seals. 3. A can of black engraving ink, still wet. 4. A set of steel dies. He reached into the crate. "This," he said, holding it up, "was found inside." It was the eagle die, the perfect, smooth forgery. "And this," the judge said, holding up the leather-bound notebook of Jedediah Croft, "is the official record of the true territorial seal, flaws and all." He held them side by side. Even from a distance, the crowd could see. One was a detailed, flawed, real thing. The other was a smooth, perfect lie. "The evidence is irrefutable," the judge declared. "A conspiracy to defraud the citizens of this territory, to forge the seal of this court, and to steal, by means of fraud and intimidation, the property of Miss Rowena Vale, has been discovered and exposed. Hollis Crane, you are under arrest. Sheriff Murdoch, you are under arrest. and a federal marshal will be sent for to investigate the full involvement of the Silver Comet Railroad. A sound began in the crowd. It was not a full-throated cheer. It was a strange, hesitant, bubbling sound. It was the sound of cheers mixed with doubt, the sound of men who had laughed at Rowena yesterday, and who had just seen her vindicated today. The sound of a town whose entire sense of gravity had been tilted. Habits, especially cruel ones, do not die in a single afternoon. They had seen the truth, but the old, comfortable lies were still easier to believe. The cheers were for the spectacle. The doubt was for the woman who had won. Rowena heard it. She felt it. She had won her forge. She had won her name back. But she was, in their eyes, still the gimp. Still the woman Crane had painted her as. She had won, but she was still, profoundly, alone. Her leg, which had been a dull roar, was now a white-hot scream. The adrenaline was gone, and there was only the pain. She sagged, her good knee buckling, and she would have fallen. But Eamon was there. His good arm was around her in an instant, taking her full weight. He ignored the judge, the crowd, the deputies leading Crane away. He ignored it all. He looked only at her. "I have you," he whispered, his voice rough. "It's over." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with exhaustion and a new, terrible pain that had nothing to do with her leg. "Did you hear them?" she whispered, her voice so low only he could hear. They're still not sure. Crane was right about one thing. They'll always see the limp first." Eamon's face hardened. He looked at the jeering, cheering, confused crowd. He looked at the woman in his arms, the strongest person he had ever known, who was now trembling. And in that moment, he made a choice. He did not lead her away. He did not shield her. He did the most terrifying, most public thing he could. Right there, in the center of the square, with every eye in Mescal Flats upon them, Eamon Pike slowly, deliberately, went down on one knee. It was not a gesture of supplication. His back was straight. His chin was up. It was the movement of a man lowering a heavy burden, of a man bracing himself for a great work. He knelt not to beg, but to bring himself, for the first time, to her eye level. Rowena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Eamon, what? What are you doing? Get up. They're all watching." "Let them watch," he said, his voice clear and steady, meant not just for her, but for the whole, silent square. He took her soot-covered hand, the one he had kissed in the forge, in his own. "Rowena Vale," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "I am not a man of fancy words. I'm not a man of much, but I am a man who knows what he sees. And I see you. I've seen you since the day I first brought you tea. I see the steel in you." He glanced at her bad leg, and then looked right back in her eyes. "I don't see a limp. I see the price you paid to save 3 children. I see the work it takes you to stand every day. I'm not marrying you for your land. Rowena, I'm marrying you for your iron." "Eamon?" She was crying now. Tears of disbelief, of fear, of a hope so painful it hurt. "I choose you," he said, his voice raw. "I choose the work. I choose the good days and the bad, and I choose your pace. Whatever it is, fast or slow, or if you can't walk at all, I will match my step to yours, every day, for the rest of my life. If you'll have me." The square was so quiet that the sound of a wind chime from the mercantile porch, 100 feet away, was as loud as a bell. Rowena looked down at him, this quiet, solid man, kneeling in the dirt, offering her not a life of ease, but a life of shared, equal work. She looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw the mockery was gone. It had been replaced by a stunned, gaping silence, and her own fear, the one Crane had so deftly weaponized, rose up. "Eamon, if I say yes," she whispered, the words a final, painful confession. "They will laugh. They will laugh at me when I try to walk down the aisle. I'll trip. I can't walk that far. In a dress, with them all, staring." Eamon's face did not change. He did not offer to fight them. He did not tell her she was wrong. He just accepted her fear as fact, and he answered it. "Then I'll carry you," he said. It was not a boast. It was not a grand, romantic promise. It was a simple statement of logistics, as plain and solid as a bag of nails. His voice was calm, like the surface of a high mountain lake. "Let them stare. Let them laugh. You just walk as far as you can, and when you're tired, you stop, and I will carry you the rest of the way." Rowena let out a sob, a sound of a knot, tied for a year, finally being cut. I don't have a ring," she whispered, her face wet with tears. "I do," he said. He reached into the pocket of his torn, wet vest. He pulled out a small, dark object. It was not gold. It was not silver. It was not a diamond. It was a ring. A simple, perfectly round band of dark, forged iron. It was hammered, not polished. The small, faceted marks of the hammerhead still visible on its surface. It was plain. It was strong. It was undecorated. It was, she realized, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I made it last night," he said, his voice suddenly, profoundly shy. "After the storm, I couldn't sleep, so I fired the small forge. I needed to hit something." He held it up, just as he did. The sun, which was now a sliver on the horizon, found a break in the clouds. A single, dramatic, golden ray of light shot across the square. It missed the judge. It missed the crowd. It landed, hot and bright, on the small, dark piece of iron in his hand, making it gleam like a holy relic. "Aim pike," Rowena Vale said, her voice full of tears, and soot, and iron. "You are a fool. Put it on." The wedding was set for a Sunday, 3 weeks after the hearing. The little wooden chapel of St. Lark's, perched on the edge of Juniper Basin, was not a grand place. But it was an honest one. It was built of raw, unpainted pine, and the wind, which always blew up here, slipped through the cracks, carrying the high, clean, lonesome scent of pinyon pine and crushed wild sage. It was not a cathedral, but it was, for the first time in memory, full. The whole of Mescal Flats was there. They had come on horseback, in buggies, and on foot. They were not driven by piety. They were driven by a raw, insatiable curiosity that was part superstition, part respect, and still, a deep and abiding habit of mockery. They had seen a woman vindicated by law. Now they had come to see if she would, in the end, still look like a fool. Rowena stood at the back, in the small alcove by the door. She had not bought the bolt of lace from Miller's. Instead, she had made her own dress. It was a simple, clean-lined dress of pale, unbleached cotton, the kind a woman might wear on a Sunday, not her own wedding day. It was clean. It was neat, and it was practical. Beneath its hem, she was not wearing new, fragile slippers. She was wearing her own boots. They were her low-heeled, sturdy work boots, the leather scrubbed clean of the forge's worst grime, but the soles were still worn in the familiar, uneven pattern. Thump drag. She had chosen stability over aesthetics. She had chosen the truth. From inside, a fiddle, played by one of the ranch hands from the Pike Hollow spread, began a slow, simple tune. It was the signal. Harlan Breyer, the mercantile owner who had insisted on walking her, offered her his arm. "You look fine, Rowena," he said, his voice gruff. "Just fine." She nodded, took a deep breath that was full of sage and her own heart hammering, and stepped from the alcove into the aisle. The chapel was a sea of upturned, staring faces, and the floor was wood. The first step was a declaration. Thump, the second was a confession. Drag, the sound, the one she lived with, the one she fought against, the one she had learned to ignore, was here, now, amplified by the silence and the acoustics of the pine-walled room. It was the only sound, save the high, thin fiddle. Thump, drag, the whispers began. It was not a roar, as it had been in the square. It was a low, sibilant hissing, like dry grass rubbing together. "Look at her. It can barely—" Boots! Under the dress. Rowena kept her eyes fixed on the front, on the plain wooden cross, on the figure of Eamon Pike, standing tall beside Judge Larkins, his back to her, waiting. Thump! Drat! She was halfway. 20 more feet. It felt like 20 miles. She could feel the weight of their eyes, not on her dress, but on her leg. She could feel their pity, and their scorn, and their morbid fascination. And then, from a pew on the right, it came. It was not a whisper. It was a laugh. A single, sharp bark of a laugh. A man's laugh, quickly stifled. She's hopping like a... His voice was cut off by a sharp elbow. But the damage was done. It was the sound of her deepest, darkest fear, given a voice, in the house of God, on her wedding day. Rowena Vale stopped. She did not falter. She did not stumble. She simply stopped, dead. Her body froze, her good leg locking, her bad leg dragging to a halt. The fiddle player, seeing her stop, trailed off, the note dying in a confused, scraping sound. The silence that fell was absolute. It was a terrible, heavy, thick silence. Rowena just stood there, in the middle of the aisle, her face bloodless, her eyes wide, staring at Eamon's back. She could not move. She could not breathe. She was trapped. At the front of the chapel, Eamon Pike did not turn. He did not look at the crowd. He did not raise his voice to demand who had laughed. He just stood, his head bowed, for one long second. Then he did something that made the whole chapel gasp. He turned his back on the altar. He turned his back on the judge. He took one step down from the raised platform, and he began to walk, his own boots heavy on the wooden floor, away from the preacher and toward his frozen bride. He did not hurry. He did not run. His pace was the same, steady, ground-eating pace he used to cross his ranch. He walked down the center of the aisle, his eyes never leaving her face. He walked past the pews, past the stunned, open-mouthed faces of the townspeople. He walked right up to her, until he was standing a foot in front of her, close enough to touch. He was not angry. He was not ashamed. His face was a mask of pure, solid, unadulterated certainty. "Eamon?" Rowena whispered, her voice a broken, trembling thing. I can't, there..." "I know," he said, his voice low, but not a whisper. It was a simple statement. He did not offer her his arm. He did not tell her to be strong. He did not tell her to ignore them. He simply bent. He was a man who knew how to lift. He knew how to lift hay bales and anvils and broken wagon wheels. He bent his knees, his back straight, his body a perfect engineered lever. His hands, the calloused, scarred hands of a man who builds, were not gentle. They were sure. They were as strong and reliable as the oaken beams he had set in the storm. One arm, his good arm, slid behind her back. The other, the one with the stiff, purple-bruised shoulder, went under her knees. He took the pain, the strain, and he did not flinch. He just took it, and he lifted her. He straightened up, bringing her high and close against his chest. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He lifted her as if she were the most precious, the most important, the most normal thing in the world to lift. He adjusted her in his arms, her simple cotton dress settling around her legs, her muddy, honest boots dangling free. And then he spoke. He didn't speak to her. He didn't speak to the judge. He turned his head, just slightly, and he spoke to the entire, silent, watching town. "The rest of the way," he said, his voice clear, calm, and carrying to the very last pew. "I'll carry you." It was the vow from the square. It was the promise. And it was now a fact. The sound that left the crowd was not a laugh. It was a single, collective, indrawn breath. The man who had laughed was staring, his face pale, as if he had just seen a ghost, or an angel. Harlan Breyer, at Rowena's side, slowly, reverently, took off his hat. The teamster and his wife, the ones whose boy had been saved at the bridge, were both crying, silent tears streaming down their faces. They were not crying from pity. Pity was what they had felt before. This was something else. This was awe. This was the raw, stunning, beautiful sight of a promise being made flesh, of a vow being turned into an action, right in front of them. In the plain, hard light of day, Rowena, her shock breaking, made a small sound, a sob, and she did the only thing she could. She wrapped her arm around his neck, her hand burying itself in his hair. She held on. Eamon turned. He did not rush. He held his bride, and he began to walk. His pace was steady, a single, rhythmic, solid tread. His heartbeat, under her ear, became their heartbeat. His step became their step. He walked past the pews, his chin high. He carried her down the last 20 feet of the aisle. He carried her up the single step to the altar, and he stood before the judge, still holding her, her body cradled in his arms, as if this was the most natural, the most proper, the most honorable way a man could possibly be married. Judge Larkins was silent for a moment, his own face thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Then, a slow, broad, beautiful smile spread across his face. He nodded, once, to Eamon, and he began. He did not remark on it. He simply opened his book. "Dearly beloved," he said, his voice booming in the small chapel. "We are gathered here today." They said their vows like that. Him standing, holding her with her arm locked around his neck, looking not at the judge, but at his face. They were simple, frontier vows, a promise of work, of shelter, of shared burdens, a promise to hold and to be held. "I will," she said, her voice clear. "I will," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The ring," the judge said, at last. Eamon, still holding Rowena with his powerful left arm, his muscles straining but not failing, reached into his vest pocket with his right. He pulled out the dark, hammered, iron band. He took her left hand, the hand that was stained with soot and grease, the hand that had held a hammer and a ledger, and his own. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was a perfect, snug fit. And when he pulled his thumb away, the iron, which was not fine metal, which was not polished, which was real, left a small, dark smudge on her finger, just at the base of the ring, a faint, black, perfect line of iron filings. It was the mark of the forge, the mark of her labor, and of his. It was a sacrament of smoke and steel. The judge closed his book. "Eamon Pike," he said, his voice thick, "you may kiss your bride." Eamon didn't have to lean down. She was already there. He met her, and he kissed her. A deep, solid, public kiss that was not about passion, but about fact. It was a kiss that sealed a bargain. It was a kiss that said, "We are," and the crowd that had laughed, the crowd that had whispered, they erupted. The cheer was real this time. It was a roar. It was a celebration. Eamon turned, still holding her, and he carried his wife back down the aisle, through the noise, and the tears, and the wild, joyous, thunderous applause. He carried her out of the little chapel, into the bright, clean air, into the wind that smelled of sage, and of their future, the wheels of territorial justice, once set in motion by the weight of public evidence, ground slowly, but they ground exceedingly fine. Hollis Crane, stripped of his fine coat and his silver-tongued confidence, was indicted by a federal grand jury. The last Mescal Flats saw of him, he was in irons, his thin lips finally clamped shut in a rictus of terror, on his way to a prison where his city-bred arrogance would be a poor shield. Sheriff Murdoch was not just fired, he was run out of the county. A man so thoroughly disgraced he had to sell his horse for drinking money. He was last seen hauling slag for a mine 100 miles south, the Silver Comet Railroad. Faced with a federal investigation and the ironclad testimony of Judge Larkins, wrote a careful, calculated letter. It spoke of rogue agents and deep regrets. They formally abandoned their claim to the Dry Creek crossing. Their surveyors were seen a month later, 10 miles to the north, chipping at the granite of a far more unforgiving and expensive pass. The deeds they had purchased were returned. Worthless slips of paper that the saloon now used to light cigars, Rowena's smithy. which had been a place of quiet, solitary labor, became the center of the town. The forge, once a symbol of her stubbornness, was now a symbol of her strength, and it became a school. The first to arrive was the teamster, the father of the boy from the bridge. He'd stood in the doorway, twisting his hat, his face grim. "Ms. Pike," he'd said, using her new name. "My boy, he's a good boy, but he's soft. I need him to learn. Well, I need him to learn how to be like you." Soon, the smithy was loud, not just with the ring of the hammer, but with the clatter of children. She took on 3 apprentices. She taught them how to read the color of heated steel, from the first pale straw yellow to the bright, dangerous white. She taught them how to shoe a horse, how to mend a broken axle, how to make a weld that would hold. But she taught them other things, too. She taught them how to read an invoice and spot a forgery. She taught them how to keep a ledger, how to sign their name to a contract. She taught them that standing your ground was hard work, but it was the only work that mattered. The children of Mescal Flats were learning to forge iron, and in doing so, they were learning to forge their own spines. Eamon's love was a practical, tangible thing. It was a language spoken in saw cuts and level lines. He sold his high country ranch at Juniper Basin and moved his life, his horses, and his tools into her world. He built a new stable behind the forge, the beams a masterpiece of joinery, the roofline as straight and true as his own gaze. But the first thing he built was for her. He started at the back door of their small, attached house. He ripped up the old, uneven stones. He spent 4 days just tamping and leveling the earth. His eyes squinted against the sun, until the ground was as flat as a tabletop. Then, he laid a walkway. It was made of thick, smooth cedar planks, sanded and oiled, running all the way from her door to the lip of the forge. There was no gap. There was no step. There was not a single nailhead to catch a boot. It was a perfect, seamless, solid bridge. The first time Rowena walked it, she had stopped in the middle. The familiar, painful thump drag of her walk had softened. The drag was gone, replaced by a smooth, quiet shush of her boot on the wood. It was the sound of her pain being seen and being met. She had stood there for a long time, her hand on the iron ring, tears tracing clean paths through the soot on her face. Eamon had just watched her from the stable, saying nothing, his hammer in his hand. Every plank was a love letter. Their lives found a new rhythm, one defined by the sun and the work. The evenings were the reward, when the long, purple shadows stretched from the anvils and the air cooled. They would sit on the new porch Eamon had built, their shoulders touching, leaning against the same post. They spoke, but they also listened, their silence a shared, comfortable blanket. Often, they spoke with their hands. He would take her hand calloused, strong, the small smudge of iron from her ring now a permanent, faint tattoo, and he would trace the lines on her palm. A silent question. She would respond by turning her hand over and tracing the long, puckered scar on his arm. A silent comfort. His fingers, broad and rough, would point to the sky, drawing the path of the stars he knew. The Great Bear wheeling over their forge. Her fingers, small and stained, would draw, on his knee, the plans for a new, bigger bellows, a map of their future. Some nights, when the last job was done and the forge was banked, the coals breathing a deep, pulsing red, he would find her. She would be standing by the anvil, her back to him, her shoulders slumped with the day's fatigue, her bad leg throbbing. He wouldn't speak. He would just come up behind her, his presence a sudden, welcome warmth. He would place his hands on her waist and his chin on her shoulder, and in the dim red light of the dying fire, they would dance. It was not a cotillion. It was not a reel. It was a slow, heavy two-step, a simple sway of tired bodies, and it was Rowena who led. She leaned her weight on him, and her limp set the time. Thump, sway, thump, sway. Eamon, solid as the anvil, held her, and he followed. He did not pull. He did not rush. He did not force the rhythm. He matched his step to hers, accepting her pace as the only one in the world. It was a dance of exquisite patience, a dance that proved that love did not have to be fast to be beautiful. And when the fire was just a bed of embers, he would turn her to face him. He would kiss her. Their kisses were not the frantic heat of a new sparked flame, but the deep, abiding, steady warmth of the coals. They tasted of smoke and sweat and the iron of their lives. His lips were chapped from the wind. Hers were soft. He would hold her, his arms a circle of safety, an embrace tight enough to anchor her, and gentle enough to let her breathe. It was a passion born not of desperation, but of absolute, unshakable, and respectful certainty. The town of Mescal Flats learned. The laughter stopped. The whispers died. When Rowena Pike walked down the main street, on her smooth plank walkway or in the dust, the men in front of the saloon no longer sneered. They would see her, and see the tall, quiet man who was often by her side, and they would nod. Ms. Pike, Mr. Pike. It was a nod of respect. They had seen her go into the ravine. They had seen her stand on the anvil. They had seen her carried like a queen down the aisle of the church. They had learned, finally, that courage was not the absence of a limp, but the will to walk on one. On the porch of the little chapel, right where Eamon had carried her out, there was a new sign. Judge Larkins had carved it himself. It was not a verse from Scripture. It was a piece of frontier wisdom, hard-won and true. It said, "If you are mocked for the way you walk, let your love carry you the hard part of the way. It is also how we find our way to each other." And from that porch, you could look down into the valley. And every night, no matter how late, you could see the light from the smithy. It was always on. It was the heart of the town. And if you listened, you could hear the distant, steady chink, chink, chink of the hammer. They were mending wagons. They were shoeing horses. And sometimes, late at night, a young couple, nervous and in love, would come knocking. And Eamon and Rowena would fire the forge. And together, they would make a new, dark, hammered ring. A ring of iron. A ring that was strong and real. And, like the two souls who made it, would not, could not, be broken. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from, and what your thoughts are on Rowena and Eamon's journey. We love to hear from you. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us a little extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.